Thank you for listening to episode 1 of The Epilogue. I'm Joe Guarneri. Today I want to discuss what is quite possibly the most chaotic novel I've ever read. And that's chaotic in the best way possible. I was enthralled throughout all 740, however many pages this was. It was a surreal experience. It was on my to-read list for a long time now, and I finally got around to it. And that book is J.R. by William Gaddis. So before we get into the book, I just wanted to give a quick intro of myself and what I hope to do with this podcast. So I've been reading since I was a child. I got into the classics in early high school. I read Great Expectations, and then it was all uphill from there. I got into the experimental avant-garde genre probably 7 or 8 years ago and have been really into that. It's not the only thing that I read, but it's a good bulk of it. So I started that with David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest, and then got into William Gaddis and Don DeLillo and Thomas Pynchon and the usual gang of avant-garde experimental suspects. And so the reason that I wanted to do this podcast is because there are some great content creators out there talking about these works, talking about the classics. And I feel like if we are going to keep these works alive, we need everyone we can get to participate in those discussions that are happening primarily online now. And the last few years of the literature content creation space has been really great. We've gotten a lot of people interested in serious literature, and I just wanted to play a small part in that. So the novel we are going to be talking about today, J.R. by William Gaddis, again, highly recommend, and we're going to talk about why. So I picked up the New York Review of Books edition that came out, I believe, in 2020. Might have been early 2020. This is a great edition. A lot of people don't like the covers of the editions. I think they look great. So they released JR, and they released the Recognitions, which I read before these editions came out. And if these editions were out, it would have made acquiring those books a lot easier. It was pretty hard. I tried to find a copy of the Recognitions, I think at the beginning of quarantine, and it was very difficult. I ended up having to purchase it from an independent bookseller in, I can't remember the exact state. I think it was Iowa or something like that. So I'm super excited that the New York Review of Books is putting these out. I hope they do that for authors like Joseph McElroy, authors like Alexander Theroux, and I think because of the success of JR and the Recognitions, they will hopefully do that. So let's get into the book. So just a quick overview of what the novel is about. At its most base level, it is a satire of American capitalism and American finance set in the 1970s. It follows the rise and fall of J.R. Van Zandt, who's a 6th grade middle school student who, after his class, visits Wall Street on a field trip, builds a multi-million-dollar empire that transforms Wall Street. So it's a satire, obviously. And then kind of circling the JR family of companies and that storyline, you have the school board of JR School. You have the Typhon Corporation, which is kind of a huge corporate conglomerate that basically controls Wall Street. You have a group of struggling artists, all of whom are stuck doing menial, purposeless jobs that they do to support themselves so that they can eventually create whatever they're trying to create, whether it's a novel, sculptures, painting. The irony is that none of them ever do. And so all of these different kind of pockets of interaction are going on throughout the novel. They intertwine, they occasionally join together in the end. Everything kind of comes together pretty nicely. And so the novel's kind of claim to fame, which you probably know even if you didn't read JR, is that the book is comprised of probably 90 or so percent unattributed dialogue. So you have here and there narrative scenes where Gaddis describes through a transition, which we'll get into. And aside from those few transitions that are spread throughout the book, you have unattributed dialogue. So you're kind of left to figure out who's speaking and where the characters are. Occasionally, you'll only hear one half of a phone conversation. You're kind of listening into the phone conversation through the person who's on the phone. So things like that. It can be incredibly jarring. The key, though, is that every character in the book has some sort of verbal habit or way of speaking that signifies who they are. So, for example, there's the principal of JR School, Principal Whiteback, who speaks in this kind of superfluous, overwrought language where he's trying to seem more erudite than he actually is. And he overuses the phrase "that is to say." So he'll go on these long tangents, and throughout the tangent you may see the phrase "that is to say" come up 3 times, 4 times, depending on the length of it. And so that's how you know it's Principal Whiteback. JR talks in this kind of childhood slang when he refers to an object or a deal or something like that. He'll say something like "this here book" or "this here pamphlet" or something like that. So you know that that's JR. There's a character, Jack Gibbs, who's a kind of stand-in for Gaddis. He speaks in these erudite kind of sentences, and he's often drunk, so he'll go on these drunken page-long rants where he's kind of combining multiple issues that he's having, discussing things pertaining to the person he's speaking to, but also things that they have no idea what he's referring to. And those kind of drunken rants allow you to say, okay, that's Jack Gibbs. At the beginning, it is very jarring. You don't know who anyone is, but you pick up on all this pretty quick. And then after that, the book is not hard in its prose. It's the difficulty of the book comes through its content, trying to follow the corporate dealings that the characters are involved with, trying to understand the financial and stock exchange jargon of the time, and then of course just trying to figure out where you are, who's in the particular scene that you're in, and how that particular scene is going to connect to all of the chaos that the book has introduced you to up to that point. It's a lot at once with regard to content. The prose is actually very readable because a lot of it is everyday dialogue, everyday language, and Gaddis was just a master of capturing how people actually speak. A lot of times you'll read a book and you'll say, this is brilliant, but I've never heard anyone speak this way. This book, you can pick out 3 to 4 characters within the first maybe 50 pages of it where you can say, I know someone who speaks like that or who acts like that, just because the dialogue is so real and so natural. So we should actually talk about the characters too. So in typical William Gaddis fashion, there are a ton of characters, all of whom are connected in some way, either presently or in the past. So, of course you have JR, you have kind of his closest business partner is a man named Edward Bast, who's this composer, the son of a successful composer who is kind of aimless. He's trying to live up to his father's legacy as this great composer. He works as a substitute-ish teacher at JR school, ends up owing him a few dollars for train tickets on a field trip, and then JR kind of ropes him into working for him. So Edward Bast is the person who JR conducts all of his business through for the most part. So JR communicates with people over the phone with a handkerchief tied around the mouthpiece of the phone in order to sound older. But when there needs to be a public appearance or an in-person meeting or something like that, JR sends Edward Bast as his messenger, and he kind of gains this public persona as the business mastermind or a business leader, and this is not what he wants. All he wants to do is get through this experience with JR in order to make a little money and just be able to compose his music, his art as he wants to. So you also have Amy Joubert, who's JR's teacher. Her father and uncle work with the Typhon Corporation, which is this huge corporate conglomerate that has kind of its hand in everything throughout the book. Really, it's a stand-in for just the typical huge corporation. You have a collective of artists. So you have, again, Jack Gibbs, who falls into that. His friend Thomas Egan, who's actually another stand-in for Gaddis. He's this character who published a significant work of fiction a few years before the events of the novel. You have their friends, including a man named Schramm, who's a writer who actually ends up committing suicide in the book. And this collective of artists is kind of struggling to find the purpose of what they do. Is the question that kind of outlines everything, but especially them, is it worth it to create art in the contemporary world? Is it worth it to work a job you hate just to enable yourself to be able to create something, a significant work of art? Is any of that worth it in the end? And so that collective of characters was for sure the best part about the book for me, because I see a lot of my own thoughts and my own concerns through them. You also have the Bast family, who is going through a big legal battle over an estate of Edward Bast's uncle, who has passed. And you have his two elderly aunts. You have Stella, his cousin, who's now married to a man who has taken over the Bast family business, which is General Roll, which is a manufacturer of the rolls that go into player pianos. Gaddis had a fascination with the player piano. He saw them almost as a death of the artist or death of the musician type of thing. The most obvious point about all of these characters is that none of them are where they want to be. So JR is chasing fortune, and though he does it in a childlike way, he still is chasing it. Edward Bast just wants to be a composer. Amy Joubert is the daughter of these corporate tycoons, and she's trying to get to a place where she can appreciate the world for what it is, a world outside of this corporate Shark Tank where everyone is corrupt and everyone is trying to manipulate everyone else for their own personal gain. Thomas Egan, who, much like Gaddis himself, published a significant work of fiction years before the novel takes place and is just yearning to get back to work on a play that he's had in production for 10 years. You have Jack Gibbs, who just wants to write his book, which has also been in progress for a while. And all of these characters are embroiled in these family disputes. Almost all of them are either divorced or in the process of getting divorced. If they are married, they are embroiled in these corporate plots and these political plots and manipulations, all of which, again, overlap. And so through these characters, Gaddis has a ton to say about the current, at his time, state of art, the state of the world, and how that world views art. So Gaddis's opinion on that was that it views art in a commercialized sort of way. For example, there's an extremely wealthy heiress in the book who collects the paintings of an up-and-coming painter who's friends with Gibbs and with Egan, and she locks them away so that they can't be sold until their price goes up. So I do want to briefly talk about my experience reading the novel. So I have read quite a few of the infamous postmodern tomes, like The Recognitions, like Gravity's Rainbow, Infinite Jest, William Gaddis' The Tunnel, Don DeLillo's Underworld. And while those are phenomenal works and they are rewarding in ways that would take a whole nother podcast to discuss, JR was the one that's the most fun to read. And this takes me back to what David Foster Wallace used to say about experimental prose still needing to be enjoyable to read. I had so much fun reading through JR. It was one of those books that when you're not reading it, you can't wait to go home and get back into this chaotic world, because you never know what Gaddis is going to throw at you next. You never know how something that came up 200 pages earlier is going to become important again. And so for me, the book became this enjoyable about 200 pages in, because again, it is jarring at the beginning, and it's even more jarring if you go in completely blind and don't consult any of the synopses or the guides that are posted on the internet. It is extremely jarring, but as soon as you get into it, again, it flows and the pages fly by. Another point that was almost cathartic for me was the fact that the book displays perfectly how cut off human communication can be. And so as someone with a speech disorder, I am very much used to people cutting me off either out of the fear of being in an awkward situation or just an attempt to help me get through a word or a sentence or something like that. I am very much used to people cutting me off. So it's interesting because in JR, almost every sentence of the book is cut off by another one. There are few situations where a character is allowed to get out their full thought. And so the book caused me to reflect on this and realize, well, everyone is cut off. Everyone is struggling to get their last word in. And so something, like communication, which especially growing up was very hard for me, it turns out can be difficult for everyone because of the speed at which we talk these days, the speed at which things occur, and especially now with the internet and social media and all that, the sheer intensity of all of the information you're getting at the same time is very much like drinking through a fire hose. All right, so that is a very, very brief and simplistic overview of the novel. If you haven't yet read JR, I hope that that's enough to get you motivated to do so, because again, it is extremely rewarding. So now I'm just going to go through a few points about the book that stood out the most to me as being representative of what Gaddis is really trying to get at with the book. So the first is going to be the psychology of JR himself. So JR's business dealings are incredibly convoluted. He begins the novel mailing away for certain goods and items and using them to make a quick buck. So, for example, he buys a ton of plastic utensils from the United States Navy and sells them to the Army, which is hilarious. And he makes some cash off of that. He also takes seriously a speech by the Typhon public relations guy. It's a character named Davidoff, who encourages JR and his class, now that they own a share of Diamond Cable stock, to participate in the responsibilities of a shareholder. And of course, Davidoff does not mean this seriously, but JR takes him seriously and files a lawsuit against Diamond Cable. So also hilarious. They end up paying him a small amount, and with the funds from all of this, it's not exactly explained how, JR buys a lumber mill. It's an old kind of broken down lumber mill. He uses their pension fund to buy a brewery, and from there he buys everything from a wallpaper company, a tech company. He ends up owning a plot of land on which an Indian reservation has taken up. He ends up buying a publisher, and it goes on from there. And again, it's hilarious all the way through, because JR is doing what he's doing here because it's what he thinks you're supposed to do. So one of his kind of taglines throughout the book is, "This is what you do. That's what you do," because he is surrounded by a culture that is attempting to commercialize everything. So Gaddis has said that he specifically chose to have JR be the age he is, which is about 11, because he has not developed cognitively to the point where he has universal morals. So if we go back to our Psychology 101 theories of development, and we look at something like Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development, you see JR is in that conventional stage of morality in which he's conforming to this good boy, good girl conception of morality. He's conforming to avoid disapproval and to avoid punishment, but he's doing all this in this hyper capitalistic sort of way where JR, as an almost blank slate, is a perfect reflection of the world around him. He's the perfect reflection of this cutthroat corporate world in which he finds himself, and the field trip just accelerates what he would have probably become anyway, which is a bright and highly motivated young person who knows absolutely nothing but greed. So something else I really enjoyed about the book were the narrative sections that serve as transitions between dialogue segments. So Gaddis often uses these when one character is traveling somewhere else, or when a character who is going to be the focal point of the following segment passes by, or something like that. And they're written in these kind of flowy run-on sentences that are just as chaotic as the rest of the book. And I believe that this is deliberate to not allow the reader any time to breathe. And I think Gaddis does this so that there isn't anything that takes away from the chaos of the novel. So let me read you. I'm just going to read from the book. This is one of my favorite narrative segments. "And 63 cents, Mrs. Joubert finished, a gentle bulge rippling from her knee as she shifted her weight in departure to disappear in the swirl of her skirt as the quarter bounding from the billowing trouser cuff drew Bast in a headlong lunge after the exhaust of Whiteback's car shearing from the curb, rounding the corner into Burgoyne Street to course through the shrieks of saws and limbs dangling in unanesthetized aerial surgery, turning at last into the faculty parking lot and into Gibbs' limited vista from a second-floor classroom window, watching Mrs. Joubert alight and come toward the portal beneath him, knuckles gone white where he grasped the cold radiator, staring down into the loose fullness of her approach till it was gone beneath the sill. And he turned back to the darkened classroom to face the talking face and flattened animation on the screen itself until the tension of watching without listening broke the surface in a slight twitch of his own lip, and turned him back to the window, looking down, now into the wide eye of a camera aimed up at himself and the frieze of teachers similarly abandoned in windows surmounting the dedication of the school hewn over the entrance. So that's just an incredible passage there. It gets you from Amy Joubert's conversation with Edward Bast through her walk to JR's school and into the classroom of Jack Gibbs without missing a beat at all. Is it incredibly hard to read the first time through? Absolutely. Absolutely it is. But once you get into this, these types of segments begin to flow very, very well as the book goes along. Gaddis himself actually said in an interview that the words on each page of JR are not meant to be scrutinized. You're not supposed to analyze every single word as you go through JR, and I'm not sure if I agree with that. I think I got more out of the book when I was overanalyzing than when I was just trying to take every segment for what it was and just allow it to wash over me. And maybe I'm too meticulous of a reader, but to me, the enjoyment of a book like JR comes when you immerse yourself in it. So I am not going to argue with a master like Gaddis, but for me, overanalyzing was the key. Is the book supposed to be read super, super closely, or should you just read the book and take out whatever you can in your first time through? I think that's something that you'd have to decide for yourself when you pick up JR. So alongside the corporate and business and capitalism related commentary within the book, you have the phenomenal sections on art. And the overarching question among the artists of the book is it worth creating art in a world that largely does not appreciate it? And what is the state of art and of the artist today? And I think Gaddis kind of sprinkles in his answer to these questions throughout the works of the artists in the book. So Jack Gibbs, who is writing a book on disorder and chaos, which is kind of a inside comment on the book itself, but it's another topic. He's writing this very convoluted, erudite book, and I'm going to read from a passage that he reads out loud. So here it is. Posted in a Leadville saloon, this appeal caught the eye of art in its ripe procession of one through the new frontier of the 80s, where the frail human element still abounded even in the arts, as Oscar Wilde alone, observing the mortality in that place is marvelous, passed on unbrankled by that phrase, doing his best, redolent of chance and the very imminence of human failure. That century of progress was consecrated to wiping out once for all. So, of course, this is going to be gibberish to the common eye. It was certainly convoluted to me when I was going through it. And this is true for all of the parts of the book where Gibbs reads from his own manuscript. But I think if we can pull out just a small part of that passage, it hints at what Gaddis is attempting to convey here. So if you pull out just this phrase here, the very imminence of human failure, that century of progress was consecrated to wiping out once for all. So the very imminence of human failure, so the ingrained quality of human failure that's within us all, that century of progress was consecrated to wiping out once for all. So I when I was reading the book, I wondered if this was directed at the artists of the book, because that failure that should be within us all seems to escape from the corporate and business characters of the book, and also JR, who seem unable to fail and who keep growing wealthier and wealthier as the book goes on. Yet the artists of the book keep failing. Their work continues to go unrecognized. Their families continue to fall apart, a lot of times because of their pursuit of greatness within the art that they're in. And they seem to be the characters in the book who are more prone to destruction, more prone to accident, and who are generally living in squalor. I mean, Jack Gibbs and very soon in the novel Edward Bast live in this dilapidated apartment where the faucets are broken, so they run all through the day and night. The apartment is just littered with garbage and random boxes of items, and there's stacks of mail in the refrigerator and the oven, and they're eating stolen food from a can. And these seem to be the characters who are the representation of what has become of the artist in contemporary society. So one part of the book that does not get enough attention, whether that's in reviews or in online discussion, is how Gaddis and the novel treat education. So the school board of JR School is this corrupt collective of businessmen, politicians. The principal of the school is also the head of the bank. And so you have these intertwined scenarios where the school board is being used for nefarious purposes, like getting politicians elected or getting the town to alter its budgets to purchase items sold by the companies who the school board members are connected with. And it is very clear that Gaddis was aware of the changes to the school system that were going on around this time to commercialize academics and to turn the school into this standardized institution where students go to complete a set of pre-assigned goals which serve to either inflate the egos of the admins or achieve some kind of bureaucratically decided on goal that does not take into account the needs of the students of the school. And so here's a short passage from the book that really stood out to me. Put on the lights there now. Before we go any further here, has it ever occurred to any of you that all this is simply one grand misunderstanding? Since you're not here to learn anything, but to be taught so you can pass these tests, knowledge has to be organized so it can be taught. And it has to be reduced to information so it can be organized. Do you follow that? In other words, this leads you to assume that organization is an inherent property of knowledge itself, and that disorder and chaos are simply irrelevant forces that threaten it from the outside. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. Order is simply a thin, perilous condition we try to impose on the basic reality of chaos. So, of course, this is a comment on the chaos of the world, the chaos of the book, but it's also a comment on the standardization of schools. And so the book leads us to another question, which is, how does the world view education? It's not only about how the world views art, but how it views intellect and the pursuit of intellectual goals. So there's another quote that comes up in one of the school board meetings, I believe about halfway through the book, that also stood out to me. So here's the passage. The function of this school is custodial. It's here to keep these kids off the streets until the girls are big enough to get pregnant and the boys are old enough to go out and hold up a gas station. So again, the school is, in JR, the school is not a place where students are to pursue intellectual development under expert teachers who have a passion for what they do. They're in school to hold them off until they can go do something else, aka have children or commit crime, which obviously shows the attitude of the school board, or rather Gaddis's opinion of school systems of the time. So it seems like the book really focuses not only on the decay of art and artistry, but the decay of education and how we think about education. It was very clear that Gaddis had a cynical view of the world. And I think that the education sections of the book are key to that overall message. And then getting back briefly to the commercial corporate parts of the book. So JR, the character, when he builds this empire of companies, he commercializes everything. So again, this is just another satire of consumerism within American culture of the time. He commercializes everything from cemeteries to nursing homes. He comes up with a nursing home cemetery joint plan in which you can enroll for both, which is again hilarious. He commercializes textbooks, radio, absolutely everything. There's also a part of the book where JR comes up with a plan to purchase a publisher of textbooks and other books and use those publications to sell advertisements. So he proposes that textbooks that will be sent to schools and novels that will be sold include ads within them. And while this was clearly satire at the time and still satire today, it's a little more plausible in our world. So when I read this, I immediately thought of the Amazon Kindles, which display an ad for other books when turned off. So you can turn off your copy of JR and get an ad for something entirely different displayed on your home screen that's impossible to turn off unless you shut down the Kindle altogether. This would have likely appalled Gaddis, but it was interesting to me to see that even within his satire, he could be so prescient about the way the world was going. So just like Gaddis's first novel, The Recognitions, JR is packed with allusions to other novels, both obscure and classic, and also poetry. But there's one literary connection that I haven't seen anyone point out that stood out to me, and that's a connection to Tolstoy's War and Peace. Tolstoy is referenced throughout the book, primarily in relation to a character, Shram, who very frequently quotes Tolstoy in fits of agony. And according to Stephen Moore, who's the leading scholar on Gaddis, Gaddis was heavily influenced by Tolstoy. So there was one connection. There's a point in the book where Amy Joubert, who's JR's teacher, is waiting to get into the payphone JR's using to conduct his business dealings, and she overhears all of this, and they walk out of the school together, and JR's going on and on about these business deals he's up to and all of this corporate and stock exchange jargon, and Amy grabs him by the shoulders and says, just stop it. Just look up into the sky, look at the moon. Don't you see anything else besides making money? And she tries to get him to have this realization that there's more to life than what he's up to. And because it involves the sky, this immediately made me think of War and Peace. Actually, two sections of War and Peace. The first is when Prince Andrei is wounded early on in the novel in I believe it was the Battle of Austerlitz. He goes into the battle in search of fame and glory, and he's wounded. And as he's on the battlefield, bleeding out, he looks up into the sky and realizes that in his search for glory, he has neglected his wife and his unborn child. He's neglected his family, and this is one of the key points in the novel where Andrei has an epiphany, and it's the beginning of Andrei's development. It also reminds me of the scene in War and Peace a lot later in the book where the character Pierre realizes that he's in love with Natasha, and he walks out of the Rostov household and he looks into the sky, and there's a comet in arc above him. And for Pierre, this is a point of development too for him, where he decides to change his life, and he eventually goes to experience the battle that precedes the evacuation of Moscow, and which begins Pierre's journey towards achieving happiness and purpose in life. And Gaddis is kind of turning all this on its head, because unlike War and Peace, JR doesn't have an epiphany here. His conversation with Amy is confusing to him. He doesn't even understand what she means by just look up into the sky. Rather than appreciate the world around him, JR continues to talk about his business schemes, and it leads to Amy Joubert asking him, "Do you think there's a millionaire behind everything?" To which JR replies, "Yes." So I want to start to wrap up here, but before I do, I just want to talk briefly about the books that I feel were influenced by JR. So the most obvious one to me was David Foster Wallace's first novel, The Broom of the System, which is, just like JR, primarily unattributed dialogue. Not to the extent JR is, but there are full chapters where you only have the dialogue. And the Broom of the System is actually another book that, if you're into avant-garde literature, you should definitely check out. And also, the works of Evan Dara really seem to me influenced by JR and Gaddis as a whole. Supposedly, Evan Dara did not read Gaddis and refused to read him to avoid the influence, but it is almost uncanny how similar JR is to Dara's novel The Easy Chain, and also his novel Flee. The unattributed dialogue, the fragmented narrative, the tone. It's just hard for me not to see resemblances there. So that's going to do it for episode 1 of the epilogue, discussing William Gaddis's phenomenal book, JR. I absolutely recommend this. It is quite possibly my favorite book of all time, and I finished it just about 2 weeks ago, and I have been thinking about it every day. So thank you again for tuning in, and I hope to have more reviews of the best works of classic and modern literature in the future, so keep an eye out. If you want to get in touch with me, you can follow me on Twitter at Joseph Guar, and again, really appreciate you tuning in. Thanks.